So, let's go ahead and get started because we have some wonderful people with us who are, let me put it to you this way. When I saw their presentation on advocacy, I wished you guys were all in the room with me at the same time because it covers a lot of the things that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves and talk to you about it because I want you guys to hear what I heard that same day, okay?
Well, I'll kick us off. My name is Rebecca Cranston. This is Lex, and this is Sam. And we are coming here from the Northern Colorado AIDS Project. So we came all the way down from Fort Collins to come here. We actually also, though, are part of Colorado Health Network, which is a statewide organization that serves all of Colorado, with a couple exceptions. It's not super important for the purposes of this presentation. But basically what we do is we provide services to people living with HIV, and so that includes case management services, wraparound services that basically help people to overcome barriers in order to become virally suppressed. So housing, transportation, food, things like that. And we do that on one side. We also work a lot with mental health programs, and then we do finally prevention programs, and that's the example that we'll be talking about with you today is an example of our prevention programs that we have applied the advocacy process to. And full disclosure, we're still in this process, and so this presentation is really designed to give you a very practical example of how kind of the more theoretical things you might be learning in a textbook might actually apply in a real organization like ours. And so just to give you another brief overview, our prevention services include things like PrEP services, and if you guys don't know what PrEP is something, it's a pill people can take in order to basically make it so that if you are exposed to the HIV virus, you will not acquire it. We provide naloxone services to people who inject drugs. We do testing services for HIV and hepatitis C, and then finally, we do syringe access services. And what that means is we provide syringes that are unused to people who inject drugs in order to prevent the spread of bloodborne illnesses like HIV or hepatitis C. And I'm the director of regional programs, and my background is that I have been in this organization for several years now as the director. Prior to that, I started an organization in foster care. I have an MBA from Georgetown University, and I'm also a candidate for state senate up in Larimer County. And I can let Sam and Lex give a quick introduction of themselves, and I'll go on with another.
Sure. I'm Lex Leitzenheiser. I'm the program coordinator at Northern Colorado AIDS Project. Before Northern Colorado AIDS Project, I was going to CSU for social work. I was an intern at the National Association of Social Workers for Colorado, where I did a little bit of legislative work, and then I've also done a lot of queer rights work.
I'm Sam Borden. I'm the Prevention Services Manager at NCAP. And I got my bachelor's in comparative sociology, which is like a fancy way of saying anthropology and sociology at UPS in Tacoma, Washington. I've always been drawn to HIV/AIDS advocacy work. However, when I started working with this organization, I got completely head over heels sucked in passionately to harm reduction. And that is what we do with our syringe access clients, helping them meet them where they're at and get them the resources they need to stay safe. And so that is a lot of what our advocacy in this avenue is about.
So, as we're going through this presentation, these are the steps that we're going to take you through, and kind of the design of this presentation is to take you through these steps from a broad perspective, and then to show you concretely how this play is actually still is playing out for us. And I can't remember if you're going to talk about this, but just broadly speaking, so I mentioned our syringe access program, and the whole goal that we have is to make sure that, so right now we serve in our region 8 different counties, but we can only actually provide syringe access in one of them. So just that hopefully will set the framework. So our goal was to take this syringe access program that we're having a great success in Larimer County, and now we're trying to advocate so that we can pass the right legislation to make it so that we can provide this service to people who inject drugs in Weld County. And this is also coincidentally going on right here in Colorado Springs right now, because it's not legal in Colorado Springs in El Paso County either. So the first thing we'll talk about is the planning phase and the things that you have to kind of do to set forth your goals and to do the strategic planning in order to create the milestones that you'll measure your success against. Next, coalition building, which I think in my opinion is probably one of the most important steps, finding the right partners, finding the right people who are invested, and they could be some maybe unusual partnerships, people that you might not naturally think of. Establish framework and principles. Sam mentioned harm reduction, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as our framework and principles, but we'll encourage you to kind of go through this process and figure out what your framework will be. Entry points and opposition research. How are you going to enter the market? How are you, what are the legislative mechanisms by which your particular project will need to be, which arms will need to be pulled in order to get your program set up. In opposition research, who are going to be the people that are against you, and who are going to be the people that will not have some interest in you not succeeding, and how do you disarm them with your charm? Know the legislative process.
Get more than charm.
That's true. It doesn't hurt though. Media and communications, how to use media to your advantage, and how to have a solid communication plan at every step of the way. And finally, evaluate what are the measures by which, and this goes back to the planning phase, what are the measures by which you know you're successful? So I touched on this a little bit before. For the pre-planning, for the background research, you have to evaluate where you are right now. So for us, this is where we're at. So in our example, where we are at is syringe access is only legal in 10 counties in the state of Colorado, out of all of our counties, 53, something like that. And that happened in 2010. Broadly speaking, the Colorado legislature passed a bill that allowed for syringe access programs, except only pending local board approval. So really the dominoes have to fall. Boulder County was the first one, and then there were 5 after that, and Larimer County was I think the 6th or 7th, something like that. And so that was really important to understand that past. How did we get to this point? And what were the mechanisms by which what was the messaging that came before us? How can we build off that or tweak it where we need to in order to suit our local jurisdiction? So sometimes you'll be wanting to pass something at the state. Sometimes you want to be passing something at the city council because it's just a small, maybe you want to put. Another example that we have is we want to put these syringe disposal boxes in public places so that people have a place to dispose of used syringes and they won't end up in public parks. But that would be a local city council ordinance, right? So evaluate what is your ballpark, what's your game, and then where you want to go in the future. So ultimately, we envision a future, hopefully ultimately where it's legal throughout the state. And maybe eventually that will require creating a consortium of interested parties throughout the state to change the state legislature, right? Maybe that's better than changing the minds of 52 different counties. But for us right now, we're seeing the need coming from Weld County, so we're going to define our goal as passing syringe access in Weld County.
Yeah, so we just talked about our goal. So it's really important for us to have a really tangible goal, right? What are we moving towards? What do we want? So that goal was for the Weld County Commissioners to approve the operation of syringe access programs in Weld County. We're talking a lot about that research. One of those things that we found out is that in most counties, it has to be the Board of Health. However, in Weld County, the county commissioners are the Board of Health. So if we said anything about that, there's a little bit of confusion there. It was also important for us to look at next steps. So we don't want to just meet our goal and then say, oh no, what do we do next? So with that, we had to say, okay, well, we want to operate this, right? We operate it out of Larimer County. We know what we're doing. We want to do it in Weld County. So that first step was planning, taking a step back. We know what we want. We have that goal. Now, how do we get there? So first, we had to identify our key issues. Why do we want syringe access in Weld County? So what we found is that there's increased drug use throughout Colorado and that there's drug use in Weld County. We want to kind of step away and try to get ahead of the game. So we want to, before there's an HIV outbreak, before there's a Hep C outbreak, get ahead of the game and try to start those syringe access programs so we can prevent that. So what we need to do is get syringe access programs approved in Weld County so that we can kind of get ahead of that game and alleviate some of those negative effects of drug use that are happening. So our first step was research. It was that research of looking back and saying, where are we? What does our state look like? What is legislation? What do we have to do to get it legalized? From there, we had to do research around, how can we compel people to get on our side? Why do we want other people to be behind us? How can we get people behind us? So a lot of that research came from our own organization. We already do syringe access, right? And even though we can only operate out of Larimer County, we are meeting individuals that live in Weld County. So I was looking at, how many individuals are we serving that already live there? What are the issues that people are experiencing in Weld County? And then, what else is going on with this population of people using injection drugs that would make this a need in Weld County? From there, what we did is we came up with our fact sheets. We also pulled from other research. There's a lot of research that's been done on syringe access programs, both in Colorado and around the country. So we looked at those studies and we pulled from that because we want to have that evidence-based program that we're pushing, right? So from there, we came out with these fact sheets. Did you just print them out? Cool.
You don't have enough for everybody of everything, but
yeah. So those are our fact sheets. Sam came out with that. She just pretty much put everything together and said this is a very concise, summary of what we're looking at. This is the research that we're doing. We don't want to hand over this huge packet that people have to take days to read. We want something small, right? People can do their own research, but we want to do something to get them interested and say there is evidence behind what we want. So from there, we looked at creating a strategic plan. Now that we know that we have the research behind us, now that we know that there are issues that we need to address and we know what we want, we had to create that plan of how are we going to go about this. So we had to figure out who's on our side, who might be stakeholders in this, and then create a timeline of goals. One of the things with that timeline of goals is that we had to be really flexible. This doesn't just rely on us, right? We can't just make this decision on our own. We have to rely on the county commissioners behind us. We need to rely on other organizations around the state to be behind us. So we have to be flexible with that goal, right? We can't just say we want to get this done by a certain time. That's the way it's going to be. If it doesn't happen, we're done. We have to be flexible and just, go with the flow sometimes. So next we had to look at coalition building. And we had to determine those characteristics of potential partners, right? There's a lot of organizations around us, Larimer County, Weld County, there's all these organizations serving people, there's lots of government entities. So who's out there and who do we really want to reach out to? So the first thing that we looked at is who's impacted by syringe access and injection drug use. So lots of people are impacted, right? We're all probably impacted in some way or another. But who is really extremely impacted? One of those people that we figured out are impacted are law enforcement, right? They're working with people who are injecting drugs. They're going to be impacted by syringe access. Syringe access had laws that go along with it that law enforcement have to accommodate, so it's important for them to also be behind this. So that's just one example. We had a bunch. So who reaches potential staff participants staffing syringe access? We have a lot of organizations around us that do, right? We have the jail, reaches injection drug users. We have different addictions treatments places, behavioral health, all of that. So all of those people are reaching the same people that we would be reaching in Weld County. So this might impact them, right? They might hear about our services. They might be impacted by this. And then who's a stakeholder in public health? Really, this is our mission. As an organization, we're really trying to prevent the spread of HIV and Hep C and other bloodborne illnesses. So it's really important for us to say other people are really stakeholders in public health, so how can we take that next step and reach out to those people and make sure that they understand that syringe access programs are going to prevent certain public health issues. So then we approach those potential partners. One of those things that did you hand out the emails? Do you all have those? I'll do it. Cool, thank you. Cool. So we emailed our potential partners, we chatted with them. Lots of different people in our organization, whether they're case managers, whether they're me as a program coordinator, or prevention coordinators. We all have these different connections, right, in these different organizations. We've been talking to them for some reason or another. So we reached out to everybody in the organization and we said, who do you know? Who do you want to talk to? And then we sent out emails, we made phone calls, we talked in person with all of these different partners to make sure that they knew what we were doing and that they could get behind us if they wanted to. With that, we came up with our form letter, which you should see. What that is we just wrote it up for them so they wouldn't have to take the extra time to write a letter for themselves, right? We're all really busy, we know that as an organization. A lot of times we don't have a lot of time to write our own letters to support other organizations. So we wrote that form letter so that way they could just maybe edit it if they wanted to, or they could write their own, whatever they wanted. but we wanted them to be able to get behind us in an easy way. And then we said, if you want to help in other ways, that's awesome, and we'd let them. So, cool. So we also requested signatories for a coalition letter. So we're a part of a bunch of different coalitions. One of those is Syringe Access. So we asked that as a coalition we can sign on to that as all of the organizations.
So, do you have the handout that explained the requested signatories versus this? This is to send in a letter. Is
Yes.
that a step farther?
Yeah, so that is for just individual organizations, right? So whether that's, one of our behavioral health partners, no matter who that is, that organization can sign on and support. All of these different organizations might make up a coalition. So we have a coalition of syringe access providers. So we asked all of them to come together and say, as this coalition of all of these different organizations, we support this. So that coalition is kind of that group of experts, right? So it's not just one organization, it's a bunch of organizations signing on in one letter. Does that
So
make
is that
sense?
I guess what she was asking, is that the formal, the name I lost.
The form letter?
No, is that like a formal document that everybody's signing for the coalition that they're support, so it's a partnership as opposed to a collaboration? Is it a partnership or a collaboration?
What's the strength of the governance of that?
In terms of like us putting it in front of someone and them taking it as like
Yeah.
It
Cool.
100% varies. Like the county commissioners, for example, we're right in the middle of this, right? So we haven't met with those county commissioners yet. When we put those papers on the table, we have no idea how much they're gonna take, any sort of.
They may just go, yeah.
They might be
or
like,
they may
yeah,
go,
that's
wow.
great, but the police officers say something different, right? So they may pull more weight towards a different direction.
What if you get the local sheriffs or whatever to sign on too? Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. We have had law enforcement sign on. Unfortunately, the local sheriff and police chief in Greeley are not on board. And we'll talk a little bit about what that's looked like trying to get that to happen. However, our hope is that we can show, okay, you may have these two very strong law enforcement voices, but we also have this entire stack of organizations that are working directly with these people who would benefit from the services, who want this. Which voice is louder for you? So it's kind of just trying to outweigh any sort of opponents that might come out.
And I'll also add, we've talked about the opposition and the organizations, but sometimes it might benefit you to reach out to certain individuals. Like, for example, there's a woman who's been very outspoken, and she wrote a few articles in various places about her son who has been affected by injection drug use. And she's somebody that would write her own letter and maybe have a voice. So just being creative about who you can reach out to help piece together your story in a way that makes comprehensive sense.
As you guys are thinking about this, think about it in terms of those intermediary organizations. So, for example, United Way brings with it the power of all of the other guys underneath it. So when we get a letter from United Way, it's sort of like, it's not just them, it's United Way with all the other membership organizations saying the exact same thing. However, some of our legislation would look at that and say, oh, it's just United Way. It's not my favorite organization. It's not my favorite advocate. And so you're trying to cover both items by doing both of those ideas. You cover both your bases.
Well, you've also selected a rather politically and socially charged agenda. Just throw that out there. And I would tell you that 35 years ago, it would have been unheard of, A, for an organization like yours to even exist, and B, even have this discussion openly in any way, shape, or form. I remember the Reagan years, I remember Brock Hudson, I remember, I'm one of the old folks in the room, I remember all of those things. So certainly to your credit that what you're trying to do, but I will tell you too that when you know that you have something that's sensitive on various levels, to various groups of people, flip on the TV, take a look at what's happening right now in this country. It's not getting better when we start talking about support for people in these particular situations and demographics. So it makes it even harder. So sometimes I think, timing has a lot to do with it too, which, if you can't beat them, join them, run for office, right?
Well, that actually takes us to our next
Huh?
section, which is identifying our principles, right? And how are we articulating ourselves in a way to not get the knee-jerk reaction from groups who don't want to support this group of people, right? So you bring up a really good point. ASOs historically have had an easier access to starting syringe access programs because we already work in the purview of HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C. So what people often forget when we push for these measures is that this is primarily a disease reduction model.
Mhm.
It is not a drug use reduction model.
Mhm.
It is not a crime reduction model.
Right.
Those are factors that can occur, absolutely, we see them all the time, but it is a disease reduction model, and so that's why it's taken its footing in ASOs. And so,
ASO is the AIDS Service Organization.
Thank you.
But what matters is the who. The who is affected. That's what matters. So if there's stereotypes out there about the who, that makes your work all that more difficult.
Sure. And we have, kind of the double-edged sword right now of the opioid epidemic,
Mhm.
right? We have that narrative.
That's what I mean.
That narrative running pretty wild through our country.
Mhm.
And it's been beneficial to us. It's also been counterproductive to us, right?
Mhm.
So we are getting to have conversations that we probably wouldn't have gotten to have even a year ago because of this conversation. So it is about timing, right? And it's about identifying things that resonate with people, right? If all of a sudden you're like, oh, my cousin is addicted to prescription opiates, or oh, that young 17-year-old boy is addicted to something that he got out of a medicine cabinet. However moralistic it may seem to make those people somehow matter more,
Mhm.
that resonates with people. It resonates with conservative people also, which are a big issue in a lot of these measures public health-wise. And so when we're working around getting this progressive kind of public health measure passed in these counties, we do need to identify our principles, and however that principle may be solid, we do need to be a little flexible about our language when we're talking to different parties, right? So we mentioned harm reduction, right? We operate under harm reduction, absolutely. Our participants are not expected to come in to get sober. Our participants are expected to come in to be safer and to be accepted and reintegrated into a society that constantly tries to marginalize them, right? So that's our fundamental value. That does not resonate with everyone that we talk to, right?
Yeah, I can
And
imagine.
so we also talk about public health, right? We talk about how that there'll be less syringes out in the street because we're providing disposal opportunities. We're talking about less HIV and Hep C infections because people are getting access to testing services with us. They're getting access to new sharps and other works so that they're less likely to contract the virus and pass it on. So that's kind of moving it out to a larger circle of influence. And then we're talking about the dignity and importance of human lives. That's what we want to shout off the rooftops. It doesn't matter if you're a homeless person who is shooting meth in a back alleyway, or if you're someone's son with a football scholarship who had a broken leg and got addicted to opiates. I don't care who you are. You matter just as much as anyone else that's going to walk through our doors. That also doesn't always resonate with people.
Right, it doesn't resonate at all in many places.
So those are the messages that we kind of cordon off to our different stakeholders, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have certain stakeholders who are like, yes, dignity. We are doing the exact same thing. These are mental health providers. These are homeless service providers. These are, really anyone in our area that's doing this organizational work. We talk about public health with a little bit more buttoned up, kind of data-focused groups, donors.
Dollars, sorry, like cost savings
Right.
for every HIV infection or acquisition that we prevent, we're saving $500,000. That's a very compelling argument to a lot of people that you'll find at whatever level.
Money is always going to speak loud.
So how do you co-op law enforcement? I mean, what's the strategy to do that? This is a little bit harder to sell.
Yeah, so
Just
what our
something.
tactic was cut dates, is what we like to call them. And basically it was one-on-one meetings with law enforcement officials, whether they were from the county we were trying to get into, or they were from other counties around it, or from our own county that we were operating in. We wanted to genuinely approach them and ask them for their insight. We weren't approaching them saying, will you support this? Initially we were saying, what would be your concerns? What have been your experiences? What would be your biggest red flag? So that helped us kind of craft what our data needed to look like to support those worries. So if you see kind of circulating around this Wells County public health article, one, it doesn't say syringe exchange on the cover. That's tactical. Because you don't want people to immediately be like, drug use. Two, it's mostly pointed around cost savings, less syringes in public spaces, less HIV Hep C diagnoses, all of these things that are not related at all to the dignity of human life, right? This is a COP article. So this is focusing primarily on those concerns that were brought up in those meetings. We've also...
What level were those meetings? At the county sheriff, or did you actually reach all the way down to the guy that's in the rural area?
It was a total mixture. And so we certainly didn't hit everyone, right? But we had a total mixture, especially in our local jurisdiction where we were providing syringe access, because our relationship is still not perfect with police, right? We are not giving them the education that they need, and they may not understand us fully enough to cooperate. So we started there, and then we kind of connected with Evans, which is a county nearby Greeley, and that connected us to the chiefs of all of the counties, as well as sheriff's departments, things like that. So we were kind of moving up the ranks and down the ranks as we were going along for different motives, right? One of my motives was like, I want our syringe exchange in Larimer County to work better. Like, I want our participants to have less negative interactions with police officers. So I'm going to start meeting with these police officers with no other motive than just to get their ideas on what would serve them better, right? So that helped us build better relationships with kind of that approach of like, I want to help you, I want to understand you. I'm not coming in here guns blazing telling you to accept this right off the bat or trying to use your contacts, but that allowed us to get contacts and kind of open up that conversation.
So by the time you hit county sheriff's level, you already had a culture of trust going there?
A little bit. So we did say like our sheriff's department in Greeley and our police chief do not support us, right? So I've had coffee with our police chief in Greeley. We've met with him in a broader context. We've met the sheriff before and had a conversation with him. And individually, those were very polite, diplomatic conversations. Both of them have shown themselves to be very resistant to any kind of data that we throw their way. And that's something you'll encounter, is like, if I say to him, hey, we have 3 years of evidence in Baltimore that crime went down in this area block where our syringe access was operating.
It's Baltimore.
It doesn't matter. It's Baltimore. You can't measure crime. Crime goes up and down. There's really no way to categorize it. It's just not going to land. So you got to take other tacks with them, and you got to understand, like, we're meeting our syringe access clients where they're at, and we got to meet our opposition where they're at too. It's like,
Have they articulated their opposition?
they will at this county commissioners meeting.
So I'll add that it remains to be seen whether this is going to pass. We'll probably know in the next, we'll at least know the next steps in the next few months. But with that said, so our hope would be that they would support us, right? But if they won't, maybe our ask is that, okay, maybe you don't support us. Maybe you can't publicly say this for whatever reason, political, whatever, but don't publicly oppose us. That might be an ask you can make. And if they're not willing to do that, like, maybe you just need to decide that you're gonna go ahead anyway, and you're gonna try to make whoever's in your stack of support letters is gonna outweigh this law enforcement contingent in our case. And that's probably what we're gonna have to end up doing. And at that point, it still benefits us to have gone through this process with the law enforcement officers, because if and when it passes and we're running our syringe access programs, we want to be able to work productively with them. We don't want them sitting outside of our offices waiting to arrest people as they're coming out getting syringes, right? So we still want to be able, regardless of who wins, when we win this, we want to still be able to work productively with them. So this whole process, even if we don't get our immediate ask or two, is still very valuable.
Finesse. It requires some finesse.
Yeah, and we don't want them to feel like we're speaking around their backs, right?
And one of your selling points, since you're doing it for the purpose of disease prevention over crime prevention, I mean, that was the selling point, that their officers aren't going to be exposed to these bloodborne illnesses that they might be if they don't support it.
There's a lot of data to suggest that. We do talk about that.
Yeah, that's another thing that comes up a lot that they're just not quite accepting of. But yeah, absolutely. We talked about harm reduction legislation, right? So we have a couple different things that protect participants of a syringe access program. There's also legislation called needle stick prevention. So if someone has sharps on their person, they're being searched by a law enforcement officer, if they say, hey, look, I've got sharps on me, these are where they are, they should not be issued a paraphernalia ticket. However, if police officers don't understand that, and they're issuing tickets anyway, or if participants or just people on the street don't understand that, then they're gonna keep their mouth shut, the officer's gonna reach in their pocket, and they're gonna get stuck. So there are ways to prevent these issues, and they're mutually beneficial, right? But if there's not cooperation from both sides, and the law of the land is not the law of the street. We've learned that all time and time again.
What percentage of your population that you're serving actually are committing crimes that get them into the system?
Well, we have camping tickets in Fort Collins, so that's a huge thing for a lot of respects.
So, I mean, those kind of things clog up the courts. Do you guys ever like reach out to the judicial side of it and try to advocate on that side of how much this is clogging us up?
Yeah, I had a pretty unproductive meeting with the district attorney. We do, I guess, play lawyer sometimes for our clients. Like, we're certainly not lawyers, we're doctors, but we do know the laws that we operate under. So we'll write letters of advocacy for our clients to make sure that our work is not causing any more municipal strife for them. We'll also occasionally talk to their public defenders if there's something we can do in terms of preventing or like providing legislative information around the syringe access. Beyond that, there's not much that we can do other than being active in community coalitions, going to the city council meetings, doing our parts in those sort of arenas. I wish that we were lawyers and be really wonderful.
Well, I guess I'm just more thinking in terms of like policy change in the future, et cetera. You were saying earlier, yeah, it'd be nice to go after it at the state level rather than county by county. But if you have members of even the different county benches or whatever that have to deal with your clients, supposed clients,
Right.
Okay, because they didn't know and they had a sharp and now they have a ticket, now they're in front of, get judicial side involved at what level? How do you advocate to them to get them later on down the road going, look how this worked for us?
Well, we do have some judges who do refer folks our way, so that knowledge is there for some of them. And anytime someone gets a paraphernalia ticket, we do write to the district attorney to get it waived for them. So they see those letters flying across their desk at all times.
So can you go to those judges that you get referrals from and say, hey, look, we're working on this, join our coalition?
We have reached out to those judges to little response, but that is part of what we want to do, right?
My experience is that they remain apolitical.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not something, it's harder to have a conversation with them about how we can change a practice. Though we do have some who are part of other boards that we're on, right? So for example, there's a naloxone committee, so it's overdose prevention. So we have a lot of people on that. There's the opioid, coalition, and there are a lot of law enforcement judges, other people on that. So we're getting to have that pathway to them, talking about what are other systematic issues that exist that prevent these harm reduction measures from actually effectively working. But yeah, it's a little trickier with that system.
Yeah, it goes back to the coalition building.
It goes back to that, yeah.
To where you're coming at it from a different angle than. Okay.
You gotta end up sitting next to the right person is really the key.
Right. Elbow your way up.
Yeah, so identifying points of contact is a good segue into that. Obviously, we had to figure out where our champions were going to be in each area that we wanted to approach for support or we wanted to approach for feedback. So those might have been people we already knew, people we already worked with pretty heavily. They may have opened doors for us to other organizations, or it might have been something like a cop day, right? Or another community organization that we're part of where we're interacting with people that we might not normally see in our public health harm reduction bubble every day. We wanted to build trust by facilitating info sharing, so we wanted to make sure our organizations that were supporting us knew what was going on, were getting updates, knew how this was going to affect them, what we thought it was going to look like. This has been a huge stopping block for us along the way, is because we've had other supportive agencies who want this to happen, but they don't have as many communication skills with all of the partners who want to be involved. And so making sure that our messaging and our narrative is together has been tricky with that going on, multiple people going towards the same goal. So that's something to watch out for. It's a hard thing to control, especially if those other parties might be a little more powerful than you. But you just want to keep pestering them, making sure that you're having that communication happening, and meeting with them to shore up that narrative as much as possible. So that was a big explanation of some of our problems, but we can get into that more. And then, obviously that's part of the challenges of the coalition. So communication is tricky. We got to make sure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are. We want to make sure that people are bought in and as passionate as we are, because I know we fall asleep thinking about this, but that may not be the case with all of our community partners. And we want this to happen. It will. But we need to make sure everyone feels as bought in as we are when we're communicating the urgency well. All right. You know, we kind of touched on all of this as well. We wanted to look at who has opposed our efforts and who has supported in the past and who has opposed and supported other efforts in the past. So the beautiful thing about syringe access and harm reduction is that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. There's been advocacy around this for a very, very long time. It's a pretty grassroots sort of public health venture. And so we were able to look at other counties and talk to our other syringe accesses throughout the state and ask them, what was your biggest challenge? Who were your champions? What were some of the arguments that came up that you had to respond to? So it's been very helpful to be able to have that kind of historical background. And then we're going to make sure we're looking at who may be supporting based on data and who may be supporting based on values and who may not be supporting based on values. Experiences. That's a big thing for law enforcement, ER workers, anyone. You want to make sure that you're understanding that they have a lot of experiences that are vastly different than ours. Like, we get to meet with people one-on-one. They like seeing us. We provide them with something that they need. We're generally in a calm and peaceful environment. That is not the case with law enforcement or ER folks. So we got to make sure that we're addressing those challenges.
As you go through this whole process, identifying red teaming, as it were, you know, your enemy gets a vote kind of deal.
Yeah.
Have you found through your travels and your experiences in doing this that there are indeed valid counter arguments to what you're doing? And if there are, what are they, and how do you address those? Because you know, it's very difficult to say, I'm right, you're wrong. The other person says, I'm right, you're wrong. And maybe not. You know, maybe I'm a little bit wrong and you're a little bit wrong. And it's really a matter of kind of accepting, okay, maybe I don't really, maybe the unintended consequences didn't cross my brain, and you're telling me that, and vice versa. So I'm interested to know, even though I can appreciate the work you're doing, but I am interested to know what counter arguments have you found to be valid?
I think one of the biggest issues that we have is lack of data, lack of information. So say someone were to...
Proof.
Yeah, proof,
That's
right?
what you're saying.
So like for Bullitt County, we don't have proof for like rampant drug use, right? We don't know what the numbers look like for people who are injecting. It's not a high overdose county right now.
Right now.
You know, right now, being the operative word. So a lot of what we're talking about is, one, things that we can imply, but not necessarily prove, which is not valid in an argument like this that has such a heated background. And things that we anticipate, but that have not happened yet. We're also talking about things that are really hard to measure, right? We can't say, we know that this many people haven't gotten HIV because of us.
Right.
We can't say, we know that this many syringes haven't been dropped inappropriately because of us.
Right.
We don't have those numbers, right? We're prevention. We don't have that future eye. So that, for us, I think, when someone argues against that, that's totally valid, because we don't have that information. We're basing it completely off of, our learned experience, what we're seeing in other areas, trends, anecdotal data, which is absolutely inadmissible in a conversation like this, but it is very valuable. And so what we try to do...
What about the statistics of how many people you have served?
Sure, yeah, we can present that. We can talk about, and so for example, like, we wanted to demonstrate that we knew that use was going down in our participants, so that's injections per day, anecdotally. We wanted to demonstrate that statistically, so we started to measure that. We started asking every single person that came in, where does your use look like today? How many shots per day? So we're trying to put a better number on that, right?
And in Colorado, you have to make this argument 52 times over in order to be successful, statewide, and every county is different. I mean, if you get out of El Paso County, you go to some other county, it's almost like being on a different planet. People don't even, it's very difficult.
Are you unable to provide that because you guys don't have the resources within your nonprofit, or because that data isn't available?
You mean like the,
Some of the things that you were just saying, we don't have the
It
answers
just doesn't
to.
exist, and counties aren't tracking it, it's just not something they're interested
both
in.
of those things, yeah. So for example, things that aren't happening because of us is like an almost impossible thing to track, right? Aside from like, let's go out and scan the entirety of this location every year and count if there's any reduction in found syringes. We can do that. We're kind of doing that right now.
Could you say across the years, the HIV infection rate in the county?
Sure. And we have those numbers, yeah.
Okay.
So we do have those numbers.
So you have, I mean, you have arguments to make when you say you can't
We
just,
do.
you know,
Well, most of
say
the
what.
arguments against us are not valid.
No,
Just
they're,
See, that's dangerous though, you gotta be careful
No,
with
I
that.
appreciate your point.
most of the arguments against us are
She's on the other foot.
not made providing opposite data, right?
Right.
So we come to, for example, for this county commissioners meeting, we're gonna come to the table armed with all of the data that we can possibly bring. The sheriff,
Yep.
the police chief, they're gonna come to the table with, I just don't think this is gonna work for our community. I think this is gonna make more crime. I think. They're not gonna come, and I hope that they prove me wrong, but I don't expect them to come with a counter amount of data. And so it's gonna be morally based, experience based, and that often will win out if it's coming from a powerful voice. So we need to safeguard against that.
The thing that we get most is enabling. You guys are enabling drug use by
Sure you do.
providing, and I think part of the reason why they think that is because the ecosystem around us, like, we're not designed, as Sam mentioned, to be an end-all be-all for drug use, right? Like, we'd like to be. In fact, the more that we move into things like behavioral health and wraparound services to provide case management, therapy, Suboxone, which helps people, you know, it's a medication-assisted therapy. The more we get into that, actually the stronger our argument becomes, because then people can see kind of, not just for the public health reason, but kind of the progression of people come to us, and if and when they're ready, they can have access to treatment from a place that's already there, especially given that there is no ecosystem of treatment really anywhere in Colorado. We do not have good options for treatment in Colorado, especially for folks who are on Medicaid, which 90% of our clients in our Surge Access program are on or eligible for Medicaid. It just doesn't exist. So people don't necessarily see that kind of, you're giving me syringes, but like, what are you doing to solve this problem? And while we're not really, this program itself isn't designed to solve the problem, it really is a place where people can come to feel human again, to come face to face. And at that point, we're building out our wraparound services so that can happen. But that's a process also. It's not necessarily the argument that we're making today.
These guys have had some experience about facing those issues in particular, and so I want you guys to hear a little bit more from them about how they have proactively done this already and faced those particular issues and what's been happening with them.
All right. So we did talk a little bit about the harm reduction legislation that currently exists in our state, and we do have a fairly progressive state in terms of harm reduction legislation. We are able to, advocate for syringe access in our counties. We are able to provide protection to those accessing our services from paraphernalia charges, as well as our staff and volunteers. We're able to give people naloxone and let them call 911 without potentially endangering themselves or the person overdosing. In most cases. Don't pay attention to wetlands, or do. And
Funding is an important point.
and funding, we also need to make sure that we can get funding, and we do get a fair amount of funding in Colorado from the Colorado Department of Public Health. So we are lucky to be prioritized by our state in the actions that we're taking, right? We do want to make sure that we know who's responsible for the ultimate decision, and we did talk about that a little bit. If the police officers don't agree with us, that's not their decision ultimately. If other stakeholders don't agree with us, that's not their decision ultimately, and we identify that, right? It's the county commissioners. In our Larimer County Board of Health, we have physicians who work with people who inject. We have people who live in the community. We have a kind of broader number of folks who work in a public health area. And so having conversations with them about syringe access looks very different than having conversations with the county commissioners in Walton County. They're not elected officials is one thing that comes into play for Larimer County that does not help us in Wells County.
Politicized.
Yes. So when we brought this up last year, for example, during a major election year, it was immediately decided it was not a good thing to move forward with. So timing comes up again. We want to make sure that we're utilizing the experience of our coalition partners. We kind of talked about that too, not reinventing the wheel. We have plenty of jobs and work outside of this advocacy effort. We're still trying to manage the syringe access in Fort Collins. We're still operating case management services, prep services, outreach, education, and all of these different things. So we need to make sure that we're getting the support that we need from other places and not banging our heads against the wall. Okay. Another thing that became very important to us was understanding that we needed to be ahead of the media a little bit on this if we wanted to regain or maintain control of our narrative. A lot of people in harm reduction will say, don't compromise your narrative. It's very easy to do when it comes to harm reduction. It's very easy to let those moralistic tones slip in or kind of make it easier to swallow, which has its place, right? But we had a newspaper come up in the Greeley Tribune, which was a front page article, nice and big, nice picture of syringes all over the place. Rebecca had her picture in there a couple of times. That was awesome. It talked about harm reduction. It talked about how necessary it was to have a syringe access. It talked about the efforts that we were taking. It talked to other stakeholders who were really supportive of the idea. It was kind of a nice trumpet announcing our advocacy in the area. And it kind of preceded us in those conversations with law enforcement and other stakeholders as well. They're like, oh yeah, I saw that article, or, you know, oh yeah, I saw that article. So kind of had to navigate that too. We want to make sure that those directly involved are educated. So that might be other health service providers, people who will be directly at that table with us advocating, as well as people who will be our opponents at that table. We wanted to make sure they had all the information and facts that they could so that they couldn't argue that they didn't know enough, right? And that goes right into communication with those who oppose. It is extremely important to talk to people who will not agree with you or who you don't think will agree with you. It's challenging. It's a very great growth opportunity, and it's also very illuminating because we operate in our own experiences, in our own bubble, right? We may not consider all of the different things that might come up that could be valid, right? That we really need to make sure to address. We take for granted some of the things that other people might find completely shocking and out of their value system. So we want to make sure that we're there to dispel myths. We're there to talk about the extreme and market and documented benefits of these programs. And we're around to address concerns and make sure that they're addressed fairly and completely.
So who are your, besides law enforcement, who are your opposers that you targeted?
In organizations, it's not necessarily across the board that people will agree with us, right? So places like, I don't know, rehab facilities that don't do medication-assisted treatment, or jails, for example, or counseling centers where that's not the tact they take of harm reduction rather than full abstinence. Community members, city council, healthcare providers who are more burnt out on the idea of people injecting than compassionate around it. There's a lot of people that can emerge that are just like, why are you devoting your energy to this? Park rangers.
So just about everybody, okay.
Well, but I would say as of right now, there aren't, besides law enforcement, there aren't that many that are outright opposing us. I do anticipate that once we get to the kind of town hall aspect, that might be different, and we'll probably get like, you know, just individuals from the community, parents, maybe businesses, I don't know. I anticipate that might come up. But right now, I don't think we have any that are actively opposing us.
Yeah, and that's the key. Do they care enough to make it difficult for you, right? And on that same tact, like, you know, we may have park rangers or parents or business owners who don't support us or don't, you know, shout out the rooftops for what we're doing, but we do have people who really do in those same groups. And so trying to figure out why they support us as a parent, as a business owner, as a doctor is helpful to trying to get those groups to pop over to our side.
So it sounds like you guys don't really have like a lot of services that are offered, they have like a religious agenda or there's agendas that go with it. You can't just go in and get the help. There's always a string with it. And it sounds like you're just kind of there to do that without really
Yeah.
moralizing or lecturing or doing all those other things.
Very intentionally so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's important to have. I think it's important to have across the board. There used to be programs called No Wrong Door operating in Larimer County where people could walk in anywhere and get services or referrals to spaces that they needed. We try and be that way as much as possible. We'll be open to what you need.
Do you think that adds to your opposition, that people have a hard time with your just doing that and not like, you know?
I don't think people understand our motives sometimes, sure. But I don't know that I've ever encountered necessarily specifically like religious pushback or anything like that. I think it's more people want to know what else we're doing other than just putting syringes in people's hands. And we're doing a lot, right? Whatever that number might be for them that's acceptable, that's different for every person of services that we're providing.
But we have kind of built out our programming around that opposition almost preemptively. So like a couple examples I can give is our behavioral health programming. We used to have funding only for counseling on one side of it for folks living with HIV, but not for people who are accessing syringes. And so as we found that like being able to provide that will, obviously it helps our clients. So that's really the first and foremost reason why we wanted to do it. But also, it really does help with kind of our argument for what we're doing for people. And then another example is community cleanup days. So, well, one of the main things that we hear is, oh, your syringes are ending up in public parks. That you're giving these out, and they're ending up. First of all, they end up there anyway. But once we started to be able to say we started to be able to say we're out in the community and we're actually organizing people and volunteers to go and do this cleanup. That kind of shoots down that narrative a little bit. So we're able to kind of preempt some of that opposition with our programming. And obviously that takes funding and that takes planning and that takes a lot of different things. It's not an overnight solution. But I think thinking about your programs in a way that's holistic makes a lot of sense.
This is Rebecca's first. All right, so as we've mentioned before, we are asking for support from community partners because they may not be able to come to the table with us when the time comes, but we want to be able to show that they support us to try and offset those voices that don't quite have our backs. So we definitely, when we reached out to those folks, we sent out an email, and most of the time it was personalized, right? We either knew them personally because we worked with them, or we knew them through other community partners, or we knew them from their work, right? So we reached out to them, we thanked them for their contributions to the community. We talked about how important it was for us to work together to really address these specific issues that syringe accesses have been known to help with. And then we also made sure that we were able to relate their work to what we're trying to do, right? So if you're doing behavioral health for folks who are no longer using substances, we are your linkage to that care. So we're talking to folks, we're that entry point. So just trying to make sure that they can see where we fall and making sure our community is a safer and healthier place. We also wanted to make sure that they were educated on syringe access, history, stats, harm reduction, because although they may be in the same realm of work as us, they may not know anything about syringe access. They may in fact be like, ooh, that's not my bag of chips. So you want to make sure that you're helping your community partners know what you're doing, why, and how it relates to them before you ask for their support. We're going to ask our audience for concrete action. This was easy, right? We typed up a letter. We said, hey, we wrote it for you. We know you're busy. If you feel like you can, please feel free to sign on to this. If you want to edit it, write your own letter, please feel free to do that as well. It was really great for individuals to do that if they were not able to through their organization. Organizations did it. We got one from the city of Denver, which is awesome. We got one from Colorado Syringe Access Providers. So that was kind of a little bit more punch because it's coming from all of the syringe access providers in Colorado. So really just trying to make sure that our action is pretty easy, but speaks volumes because a signature can really do a lot in these particular instances to show support. And then obviously you want to keep following up and asking when you're not getting that response back, because your partners are supportive, but they're also super busy. So just make sure you're reminding them that you need their help and return that help when you get a chance to.
One other concrete action that I always do, and I do this a lot as a candidate as well, you know, sometimes I'll ask, oh, will you donate $50, whatever. But even if they won't, I'll say, or if you know anybody that would be useful for me. So I think kind of using the connections you have to broaden. So in this advocacy example, you know, whether or not you'll sign on to the letter, if you know anybody that would be interested, please forward this along. Or I would always love a one-on-one introduction or something like that.
And look for supporters in unique places, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be what you think. It can be businesses, it can be, you know, a PTA, it can be, like I said, Parks and Rec. It could be really any number of people that form a community, right? It doesn't just have to be healthcare providers. I think we're back to you.
All right, well, this is just, I don't want to be too redundant, but basically, we mentioned at the very beginning to have those goalposts and those milestones that you're constantly measuring against. Obviously, the final goal is to approve syringe access. Like, that's obvious, either it passes or it doesn't. I mean, a lot of times, I think even if this doesn't happen for us this time, even if it didn't happen for us a year ago, in El Paso County, it's been, I think, 3 years of trying. I know it took several tries in Larimer County before it was finally passed. So I think there are other measures of success that you can think about as well. How many people did you engage with? How many, you know, as a result of this, are you closer the next time around that you want to try? What's your regroup plan if it doesn't work out? And because it might not, and that's what Lex was mentioning about being flexible on your goals. Sometimes there are things just outside your power. You might be the first person to have tried to pass a really controversial measure in a place. So being comfortable with that and understanding that it's not failure if you don't get to that goal, and just figuring out how to kind of regroup.